Welcome, I'm Jana with Purl Together, and in this week's technique video, we're going to talk some more about jogless stripes. So last week, I talked about why I'm not really a fan of the techniques for the jogless stripe, but since you're the boss of your knitting, I want you to be able to know a couple of techniques to go about that if you choose to do that. Just to kind of recap what I said, if you haven't watched part 1, I'll link that down below in the video description as well as right up here in the corner. But just to recap a little bit, I'm not really a fan of the jogless join techniques that I've seen so far because many of them either elongate a stitch by slipping it up to the next row, or they distort the stitch in some way in order to kind of even out those levels. So if you're unsure what I mean, when we knit, we go in a spiral. We're not just knitting a ring that sits evenly on top of the previous row. It's actually a spiral. So you have a starting point and an ending point that creates kind of a stair-step jog. So there's lots of techniques out there that try to even out that jog. But by doing that, sometimes it distorts a stitch, or it distorts, even lessens a column of stitches. Maybe you'll have four instead of 5, or 3 instead of 4, or you're slipping a stitch up, which makes it enlarged. There's several ways to go about doing that, and I'm not really a fan. I'm going to show you those because I think it's good to have them in your toolbox. There is one technique that I do like that doesn't distort anything or mess with your tension. Well, it does mess with your tension a little, but it's easily fixable. But it does change the beginning of the round, so that's kind of a bummer. That's a con for that particular technique. Having said all that, I just don't think it's that big of a deal. So I'm working on this stripy sweater. I'm knitting through the pattern. I'm on the sleeve, and the beginning of the round is under the arm. Let me see which one it is. And it's not that noticeable, honestly. Where the stripes, this is the beginning of the round, where the stripes change, in my opinion, is not that noticeable. Yeah, there's a tiny bit of a jog, but again, that can be managed with tension. So you do you. You're the boss of your knitting, and I want you to know the techniques if you choose to do them. So what follows is a couple of things that you can try and experiment with while you knit your swatch. So we're about to begin the After the Rain knit along. That will start next week. We'll be swatching for that and casting on shortly thereafter. But while you're swatching, these are some tips that you can try to mitigate that jog if you choose. Okay, let's get started. All right, last time we talked about how to mitigate this jog by just tension, using tension and weaving in your ends. And this week I want to show you how you can mitigate that in a couple of different ways. The first way is going to be by knitting into the row below to pull up a stitch and begin your new color. Now that will even out that jog, but it will also, you'll see what it'll do. So if I'm going to add this darker color now, I want to knit into the row below. So I can either just go into the hole right there and knit into that, or what I prefer to do is to take this leg and pull it up and then knit into both of those together. Okay, and then I'm going to continue knitting the dark yarn all the way around, and then I'll show you what that's going to look like after we complete that stripe. So now again, that's the first stitch is going to be a little bit loose because I just have the tail here, and I'm going to want to weave that in properly later. But let's go ahead and knit around the whole way, and then I'll show you what it's going to look like after a couple of rounds. Now this will be a stackable join, meaning the beginning of our new color will always be in the same place at the beginning of the round where our marker is. The second method I'm going to show you will require you to move the marker and actually move the beginning of your round. So depending on the pattern that you're doing, that may not be a great idea. All right, by pulling up that stitch from the row below, you can see what happened here. We have 4 white stitches clearly there, but we pulled up the last white one here and knitted it with the 4th. So now we only have 3 that are visible. So that is a factor to consider if that bothers you or not. I'm going to go ahead and knit around a couple of more rows so you can see what things are going to look like, and then we'll switch colors again to the white and you can see how this is going to work overall. You know, after you do several rounds, you can see what it's going to look like. See the big picture. Okay, here I am at the end of the dark stripe. I've knitted 4 rounds. You can tell that there's 4 stitches here, including the stitch that's on the loops that are on the needle. That is a completed stitch as well. So you can see where I slipped up here, and I have 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and I slipped the white stitch up and I started that. So that tension is wonky still, and there's still kind of a little jog there because I have this tail and I have this tail. So that's going to require, you know, moderating that tension and weaving in those ends like we did in the part 1 video. But now that I've already started, I'm going to take the old yarn here and I'm going to take that down. I'm going to put that down and I'm going to pick up the white yarn, and I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to lift this stitch from this leg from below, put it up on the needle, and knit those 2 together. Okay, now keep in mind your tension with the white yarn because you don't want to pull that and cause any puckers. And that yarn is pulling from way down here. So we want to make sure there's enough slack and that doesn't cause anything, you know, to be too tight. So we want to kind of keep that loose for your first couple of stitches before you carry on. Now again, this is a way to kind of draw up the green section and draw that up to meet the white round that's going to be coming around here and pull this up to even it out. But keep in mind that doing that creates only 3 stitches now that are visible rather than 4. So I don't know if that bothers you or not. You'll have to just experiment with it. That's another value of swatching, is obviously not only to find your needle size to get gauge, but also to experiment with whatever technique you think is going to work best. You know, like I mentioned earlier in a previous video, we're about to start a stripy sweater knit along. And so it's worthwhile to take time to figure out what technique you prefer and how that's going to work best, especially if you're going to spend hours and hours knitting an entire sweater. It's definitely worth your time. So let me finish this white stripe and then we'll look at it, and then I'll show you another technique that I mentioned earlier that will actually change where your beginning of the round is. Okay, let's take a moment to take a look at this. Right here and right here is where I did the join where you knit into the stitch below. And while that does even that up some, and you can adjust that with your tension when you weave in the tails, you know, there's still a visible jog there. Now I did begin the green after cutting it. So that is a loose tail right there. And that, you know, that can be evened up just by pulling on the tension and the duplicate stitch. This is certainly more even than it was. The other method I want to show you now, so you can compare and decide what works best for you, is where you slip the first stitch and actually move the beginning of the round. So I'm going to show you that. So the first thing you want to do is, well, all right, you can move the beginning of the round depending upon your pattern. Now, the way this might work is if you were knitting a sock or a cowl, where you can, you know, with a sock, you can begin the heel flap or whatever type heel you're doing anywhere on the cylinder. It really doesn't matter. So what I'm going to do is leave this kind of purple marker here so that you can see what happens. That's the original beginning of the round. Then what I'm going to do is slip the first stitch as if to purl, okay? Or you want to go in point to point rather than going in as if to knit, because then that twists the stitch. So slip it over straight across as if you're purling, and then we're just going to begin knitting with our new color. So drop the old color down, bring the new color up, and start knitting with that. Now again, that's the green yarn, and you were pulling that up the back. Unless you cut it, you're pulling that from way down here. So we want to make sure to keep that loose enough that it's, you know, it's not too loose, but it's not puckering or pulling or distorting the fabric. Particularly if you're using 100% wool that's going to bloom after blocking, you want to be careful to leave the first couple of stitches relatively loose. Not sloppy, but loose. So I'm just going to knit all the way around, then I'll show you what we're going to do with that slip stitch. Okay, I'm all the way back around to the beginning of the round, and I'm going to slip this marker. That's the original beginning of the round. Now, if I was just doing this technique in a project, I would go ahead and take that off because I'm actually moving my beginning of the round, but I'm going to put a new marker and show you what happens. So that's the one I slipped. I'm going to go ahead and knit into that now. And I'm going to put a new beginning of the round marker on. Okay, so there's the new one. Now I'm just going to continue going on. All right, and I'm going to knit another round just with this dark color, and then I'm going to make just a 2-row stripe so that you can see what's going to happen right away when we add another one. One thing I do like about the slip stitch technique for jogless stripes is that you are still maintaining the same number of stitches in each column or the width of each stripe. So you're not bringing one up from the row below and causing an enlarged stitch that's only 3 stitches in that width or that column rather than 4. So, you know, you're maintaining the consistency of the number of strips, the number of stitches you have in the width of the stripe. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now I'm coming up on the original beginning of the round marker. And now I'm going to knit here. And I'm going to go ahead and slip that marker. Now this stitch I'm going to slip over. Actually, I'm going to take that marker off. I'm going to slip this stitch over and I'm going to put that marker back on because that's our new beginning of the round. And now I'm going to change colors and bring up the white and begin knitting with that, keeping in mind my tension and that I'm pulling this a ways from below. The same number of stitches in each column. So I'm going to go ahead and knit the one I slipped. And now I'm going to take off that new beginning of the round marker. All right, I've just slipped that one over. I'm going to carry on and knit another round of the white since we're doing a 2-row stripe. And then we're going to do the same thing where we slip the marker over. So every time we change colors, we're changing where the beginning of the round occurs, which may or may not be okay depending on the pattern that you're using and whether you prefer to keep track of all that, because then you would have your original beginning of the round marker and then you'll have your stripe change marker. So it depends on the pattern and whether you want to deal with that or not. All right, I've completed 2 rounds for the white, and now I'm going to take the marker off, slip the white stitch over because I'm changing colors, put the marker back on because that's going to denote the new beginning of the round, and then I'm going to pick up the dark colored yarn. And that, again, that's going to come from the color below, so be mindful of your tension there and just begin knitting with that one. All right, so I'm going to do 3 or 4 more rounds, a couple more stripe change colors overall, so you can see what what it would look like overall after several times of doing this. Okay, a couple things to note here. My beginning of the round has shifted all the way over here because of the color changes and what I showed you earlier about slipping those stitches. Now, the tension is all messed up, and it's going to be certainly more noticeable when you only have 2 round stripes. This would be less noticeable if I had, 6 or 8 rounds. But I just wanted to illustrate the technique more than anything. This can be adjusted by, getting a darning needle and evening out that tension as you're across the stitches to the right and left of the enlarged one. Overall, I don't love it. And I also don't love that you're, shifting your beginning of the round. Now that might work, like I mentioned, if you're knitting a sock and it doesn't really matter where you begin your heel flap or a cowl or a hat or something like that, that's totally fine. Honestly though, it's just not that big of a deal to me to have the jogs, as I mentioned in part 1 of the Jogless stripe series. And I like the way this lays flat and you don't have enlarged stitches or stitches that come from the row below and then you only have 3 instead of 4. I don't love it. I hope you found those tips and techniques to be helpful. Let me know what you decide and what method you prefer for what project you're doing, and I look forward to seeing you next week when we start swatching for the After the Rain sweater knit along. I will put the link to that down below in the video description as well. Thanks for watching, and consider a thumbs up and hitting that subscribe button. And if you're interested in becoming a patron, head on over to patreon.com/Purl Together so you can get some information about the perks that I offer for becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.